The wind was not like anything she had known before. It howled across the ice plains in long, sharp waves, each gust like 1,000 knives, cutting against her skin. The cold was not just outside, but had begun to crawl inside her bones, making every breath slower, every movement heavier, and yet she held on to Tavy, her small furred creature, the last living warmth she had left in a world that seemed to want her. Gone. The crash had come without warning. One moment the sky was calm, and her people's transport ship was gliding through the upper clouds, and the next, it was fire and metal and screaming silence. Lyra had woken up beneath the twisted frame of the wreckage, her hands bloodied, her breathing thin, and a long scar running down her left leg from where a support beam had fallen and trapped her for hours. She had pulled herself free using only one arm, because the other barely moved, and now she sat in what was left of the cargo chamber. Pieces of the ship's wall tilted and bent, forming a crude shelter. Against the wind, the cold still slipped in from every gap, and the power cells had long died, leaving only shadows and flickering sparks from broken wires above. Tavy had not left her side since the crash. The small creature's white fur now stained with ash and oil. He pressed against her chest, curled tightly as if trying to give her all the warmth he had left, and she stroked him slowly, not knowing how many more hours they would last out in orbit far above the planet. A human listening post circled the nearby moon. It was small and old, not part of the main fleet, just a station left behind to track radio signals from deep space inside it. Only a few crew members remained, most asleep or off duty, and yet the faint distress pulse from the alien transport blinked onto one dusty monitor, low in strength and buried under layers of storm interference. Mark was the first to see it. He had been drinking rehydrated coffee, staring out the viewing window at the endless dark. When the pulse caught his attention, he leaned forward, tapped the panel, ran it again, and saw it clearer, this time a signal for help coming from a dead zone marked red on their charts, a place known only for storms and deadly surface conditions. Called the commander. The man shook his head, said they had no ships available, nothing fast enough or strong enough to survive the surface winds, that nobody could live down there anyway, and even if someone had survived the crash, they would not last more than a few hours. Mork stood there silent, watching the blip on the screen fade in and out. He remembered the last time he had watched a signal fade away years ago. Another crash, another order to stand down, and that one still haunted his nights. He had sworn to himself never again, if he could help it, he would never watch someone die, just because it was too risky, too late, or too far. He left the control room without asking. He went down to the lower hangar where an old drop shuttle sat unused for years. It had once been his own during rescue missions. Before he transferred to the station, he began checking it: fuel levels, structural integrity, life support. It was not perfect, but it could fly, and it could land rough if needed. He patched into the old systems, bypassed the launch codes, and started powering it up. Alarms rang overhead, alerts flashed across the screen, but he ignored them. His mind focused only on the fading signal below, a call for help, still alive, still waiting back. On the surface, Lyra's fingers had gone numb. She pulled Tavy closer, breathing slowly. Her vision, blurring the world outside the shelter, had turned white. Wind so thick nothing could be seen. Beyond the broken metal walls, she knew her people would not come for her. They had no idea where the ship had gone down, and even if they searched, the storms would block any trace of them. She whispered to Tavy, telling him stories of their village back home. The high trees, the glowing rivers, the warm sky. At sunset, she told him he was a good boy, and that she was sorry she could not protect him better. She said maybe someone would find them someday. Maybe not, but at least they would not be alone when the time came. High above the planet, Mark's shuttle broke through the cloud layer. Turbulence shook every bolt and joint. The cold began seeping into the cabin despite the heating units and warning lights blinked angrily across the board, telling him he should turn back, that this mission was foolish and reckless and likely fatal. But he gripped the controls tighter, jaw clenched, breath steady. He scanned the surface again, switching to thermal imaging, but the storm distorted everything. Still he dropped lower, skimming across frozen cliffs and jagged ice fields hoping to catch even a flicker of heat or movement, or something that did not belong to the wind lyra. Heard something in the distance, not clear, not real, perhaps a dream. It was a faint hum, low and strange, like nothing the planets, winds had ever made. She looked up, barely able to move her head eyes, searching the broken doorway of her shelter, but saw only snow and light that twisted as if disturbed by something passing overhead. She thought she was imagining it. She closed her eyes, her fingers still curled around Tavy, who did not stir anymore, and she felt her heartbeat slow, like a drum fading in a far room of her mind. Mark's eyes caught at a strange shape half buried in the snow just ahead. The metal twisted and burnt. He brought the shuttle down hard, landing near it, alarm still screaming at him, but he threw open the hatch and stepped into the wind, his suit groaning under the pressure, ice forming on the edges of his helmet. Within seconds he activated the beacon and pulled out the thermal scanner. One last hope, one chance inside the wreck. Lyra's breath caught her, eyes opened slightly, and through the doorway she saw a figure stepping through the storm, something tall and dark and strange outlined in lights and heat. She blinked again, thinking she was dreaming, but the figure kept coming closer, slow but real. And then she saw the light in his hand, and she felt something strange stir in her chest. Not fear, not confusion, but something older, something stronger than cold or pain or silence. She did not know what it was yet, but she held Tavy tighter and watched as the figure reached the door and stepped inside. The last thing she saw before sleep pulled her under again was the stranger's eyes behind the glass of his helmet, and the sound of his voice crackling through the cold, saying softly that he had found her. The cold was still biting, but it no longer had full control. Mark had sealed the emergency layer over the broken section of the ship and knelt beside the small alien girl, her body curled tightly around a small animal fur, stiff and frozen, her skin pale with signs of frost. Mark moved carefully, opening the warming blanket and wrapping it around both of them. He checked her breathing, slow but still there, her chest barely rising under the pressure of the freezing air around them. Looked down at the little creature tucked beneath her arms. It looked like a cross between a rabbit and a cat, with long ears and a bushy tail, its fur packed with ice but still warm near the core. Somehow it had survived with her, even in such brutal conditions. Mark placed a hand over both bodies, then activated the pulse flare outside the wreck, hoping someone at the outpost might notice it from orbit, but deep inside he already knew the chances were near zero, because the storm had only gotten worse. The wind screamed across the land as if trying to bury them back under the ice. Mark pulled out a portable heater, set it to its highest level, and let the warmth slowly begin to fill the tight, broken space of the transport. He removed his helmet, breathing in cold, dry air, watching it frost over in seconds. The inside of his suit was failing, one of the wires along the heat coil had snapped during landing, and now he could feel the numbness crawling up his arms, but he did not care, not yet. Reached into his chest pack, took out the emergency oxygen line, and placed it gently over the girl's face, adjusting it so she could breathe easier. Her eyelids flickered once her fingers twitched around the soft body of her pet. Mark leaned closer, whispering words she could not understand, but words that gave comfort. Nonetheless, he told her to stay with him, that she was not alone anymore, and that he would not leave her behind. Far above in orbit, the outpost was in chaos, lights flashing red across every board, security calling for answers, flight control trying to trace the shuttle that had left without clearance, the commander shouting over the comms demanding a response. No one could stop the launch in time, and now all they could do was watch the signal drop off into the storm. One blip sinking into a white sea of static. No one volunteered to follow, not into that storm, not with visibility down to nothing, and every weather model predicting zero survival rate. The logs were updated, the incident filed, and silence returned once more. Only one screen inactive, the one tracking the distress beacon, now joined by a second one, a faint new pulse coming from the surface. Not a cry for help this time, but a signal that someone had arrived. Back on the frozen ground, Mark began gathering broken metal pieces from the wreck and stacked them around the girl and her pet, creating a small barrier to trap what little heat the heater could give. He found a torn section of insulation and wrapped it around her legs, then took the emergency ration pack and crushed it to start its chemical warmth, placing it beside her chest. The light from the pulse flare outside cast soft shadows over the bent walls, and for a moment it almost looked like a room instead of a grave. He moved again, this time slower, each step heavier. The cold fighting back hard, his breath turned into clouds in front of his face. His fingers began losing feeling. He placed another heat stick under her blanket and sat down beside her, keeping one hand on the heater controls and the other on the pulse beacon. If the storm gave them even a few seconds of clear sky, the signal might break through and someone might come. The girl stirred her head, moved slightly, her eyes barely open. Her gaze fell on the figure beside her, this being in strange armor with soft glowing lights. Her lips parted as she tried to speak, but no sound came, her throat too dry and frozen, her strength nearly gone. She blinked slowly, trying to understand what she was seeing. The human looked back at her, his face calm, his eyes tired but focused. He held out his hand slowly, not touching, but close enough to show he meant no harm. The girl looked at it for a long time, then turned her eyes to her pet still tucked under her chin. Mark reached into his supply bag and pulled out a small thermal gel pack, pressing it gently near the creature. Its little body twitched, then gave a faint shiver. He smiled slightly, more to himself than to anyone else, and whispered something like, "Good, you hang in there too, little one." As the minutes dragged on, the cold pushed harder every breath Mark took burned his lungs, his back stiffened, his legs numb. He adjusted the oxygen feed to give the girl more and leaned against the wall, fighting to stay awake. He had been in storms before, had walked through ice fields and rescued people from crashed ships and frozen rivers, but never had he felt the cold reach so deep into his bones like this. His mind drifted to old memories, a snowy ridge in the north, a mission gone wrong, the signal. They ignored that time because it was too far, too dangerous, and the wreck they found 2 days later with no survivors. It had haunted him ever since, the faces in that ship, the logs they left behind, the helpless waiting. He had promised himself, then never again. If there was even one chance he would go, and he had kept that promise, even if this time it might cost him. The girl's eyes opened again, longer. This time she looked at him, truly looked at him. Her lips moved, no sound, but her hand shifted weakly toward his. He reached out, closed her fingers around one of his gloved ones, and nodded. Once she understood something, maybe not his words but the meaning behind them. She held onto his hand gently, her grip barely strong enough to be felt, but it was enough. Wind roared louder outside, and the light from the pulse flare began to dim as snow started covering it. Mark checked the charge one last time, adjusted the beacon to boost frequency, then leaned back against the metal wall, holding the girl and her pet close under the blankets. He had given them his own heat pack, nearly gone, his body starting to shake, but his grip never left hers. Outside, the storm covered the land with another thick wave of snow, burying everything in white silence. But inside the wreckage, a tiny spark of life still burned. Two species, once strangers, now bound by one single choice, and the quiet hope that someone somewhere was listening. The night seemed endless on the frozen planet, every hour passing like a lifetime under the crushing silence of the storm. The snow continued to fall in thick, heavy layers, hiding the broken shapes of metal and the thin line between life and death inside the wreckage. The girl stirred again, her breathing slow, her thoughts drifting between memory and darkness. The pain in her body had faded into something distant, almost gentle. Her arms still wrapped around her small pet, whose soft fur had begun to warm again under the heat packs carefully placed by the stranger. Mark had not slept. He sat leaning against the wall, half awake, eyes scanning the dull glow of the heater and the pale light seeping in through a crack in the hull. His body ached in ways he had never felt before, his mind drifting in and out like waves hitting a shore. Sometimes he forgot where he was, then the cold reminded him again, sharp and brutal as ever. But he held on, focusing on the girl, the way her fingers twitched sometimes, the way her small chest lifted when she took another breath. Those tiny signs of life kept him grounded and pushed away the urge to give up. He checked the beacon again. The The signal still weak, the storm above them still thick enough to block most transmissions. He knew rescue would not come until the sky cleared, and even then, someone had to be watching, someone had to care enough to try. He had done what he could now. It was a matter of waiting, holding on and praying the universe would not stay silent forever. Far above the planet, the human outpost remained locked in routine reports. Filed equipment checks logged, and no one willing to risk another shuttle just for a fading blip on a screen. Yet there was one technician, young and curious, who had been watching the beacon closely, even after the official log had marked the mission as closed. He ran calculations in the background, checking wind shifts, temperature dips, atmospheric pressure. Anything that might create even the smallest window to see through the storm. Hours passed. Then the storm began to thin, not by much but enough for a faint break in the clouds to appear like a crack in a solid wall, and in that brief moment, a signal reached the outer scanner of the outpost, a double pulse, steady and rhythmic. Not natural, not random, something human, something real. The technician stared at it, heart racing, then called the commander again, who sighed and said, "Fine, give it one more look just in case, but we're not sending anyone down there until it's safe." Back on the surface, Mark began to lose feeling in his hands. He had taken off one glove to better adjust the oxygen mask on the girl, but now his fingers were purple and stiff. He rubbed them together, tried to create some friction, but the warmth left hours ago. He leaned closer to the girl, checking her again. She was still breathing, and that was enough for now. The creature in her arms opened its eyes once, then nuzzled against her neck, soft and quiet, as if thanking the man who had kept them alive. Mark tried the radio again, speaking into the mic with a voice rough and cracked his words, barely audible even to himself. He gave coordinates, repeated them twice, then let the device fall to his lap. The light from the flare outside had dimmed too far, so he began assembling another one using the few parts he had left, piecing them together with numb fingers, the fire starter barely working in the frozen air. But finally a spark caught, and a weak flame danced in the cold wind, just enough to give a signal, just enough to show someone that they were still here. He returned to the wreckage, placed the flame near the opening where it could shine through the broken shell, then sat down again beside the girl, pulling another blanket over them, his eyes closing for a moment, not in sleep but in deep stillness. His breath fogged the air in front of him, but he no longer felt the pain in his chest or the tightness in his limbs. His thoughts blurred between past and present, between choices made and chances lost. Girl opened her eyes again, this time wider than before, the haze in her vision clearing slowly. She saw the man beside her, eyes closed, face pale yet calm, and the sound of his breathing was steady. Her small hand reached out, fingers brushing against his sleeve, and in that moment, something inside her shifted. The fear that had gripped her since the crash began to melt, not fully, not yet, but enough for her to sit up, a little weak and trembling, but alive. She looked around, saw the strange tools, the glowing heater, the careful way he had arranged the space around them, and she understood then that this man had come for her, not by accident, not by chance, but by choice. He had seen her signal and decided to face the storm to find her when no one else would. She looked down at Tavy, who blinked up at her, then nestled closer, and for the first time since the crash, she felt warmth, not from the heater, not from the blankets, but from something stronger than either. Mark opened his eyes as he felt her move and saw her watching him, her eyes large and filled with something deeper than words. They could not speak the same language, but he nodded slowly and gave a tired smile that said everything she needed to know. She whispered something in her own tongue, soft like wind through leaves, and he did not understand, but he felt the meaning behind it, like a quiet thank you from one soul to another. In the distance beyond the storm, a small dot moved across the sky, a scout drone sent from the outpost, scanning for any trace of heat or motion, and as it passed over the wreckage, it caught the flicker of the flare and the faint signal from the beacon. It sent a ping back to base, where the technician leapt to his feet, shouting for the team to look again, and this time they saw it clearly. 2 life signs, one human, one unknown, both clustered in the same spot in the middle of the dead zone. The order was given: quickly send a rescue shuttle as soon as possible, flight crew. Scrambled systems warmed, engines roared, and for the first time in many hours, the path to hope opened once more. While on the frozen surface, Mark closed his eyes again, this time not in despair, but in quiet relief, because somewhere deep inside, he knew they had been seen. The cold still pressed in from all sides, but inside the broken shell of the transport, something had changed. The silence was no longer hollow. It now held the sound of slow breathing, the soft rustle of movement, and the weak but real crackle of a flame trying its best to fight back the dark around them. The girl sat up with effort, her back against the wall, her arms still wrapped around her pet, whose eyes now stayed open longer, alert and full of quiet life again. She looked at the man beside her, watching every move he made, trying to understand not just what he was doing, but who he was. Mark had begun repairing the heater again. Using a wire from the emergency light and a battery cell meant for the flare, the parts were mismatched, and his hands trembled with every twist, but he worked through the pain, each moment driven, not by orders or duty, but something more personal, something deep inside, that refused to let go as long as even one spark of life remained in that small frame beside him. The girl did not speak much. She only watched, learning through motion, through gesture, through the way he gave her the warmer blanket and moved closer to the edge of the broken wall where the air was colder, just so she and the creature would be safe and more warm. She touched his jacket, once not with fear, but with simple wonder, her fingers tracing the human fabric, rough and worn and unfamiliar to her kind, but strong and filled with warmth. Outside, the wind had slowed slightly, the worst of the storm passing over, though the cold remained sharp enough to bite through any weakness. The sky above had begun to shift, gray clouds parting in some areas, letting light spill through like broken glass across the white plains. The wrecked transport was half buried now, snow covering most of the exterior, only the signal flare and a part of the bent entrance still visible from a distance. Mark knew the storm was changing. He could feel it in his bones, every instinct sharpened from years of survival training told him rescue might actually reach them now. If the signal had pierced through, if anyone had seen the pulse, then there was a chance. He adjusted the beacon again, switching to an older frequency, one often used in old human rescue missions. Maybe the station above still monitored it. Maybe someone would hear. He returned inside, sat beside the girl, again placed another heat cell between them, and leaned back, letting his body rest but not sleep. He was too cold, too alert, too aware of how thin the line was between life and silence in a place like this. The girl turned to him slowly, her eyes filled with something beyond fear, beyond confusion, something like quiet respect and a question she had been holding for hours. She pointed at herself, then said her name slowly, clearly, once, then pointed at her pet and said its name as well. Mark listened carefully, repeated both names with care, even if his voice cracked from the frozen air. Then after a pause, he pointed at himself and said his own name, not once, but twice, as she could remember. Her lips moved gently, repeating it almost correctly, her voice soft but real. It was the first bridge built between them, and though it was small, it was strong. Time passed slowly, but not empty. They shared silence and shared warmth, and shared that invisible connection that grows not from long conversations, but from surviving the same storm, from choosing to stay when leaving was easier, from giving when there was little left to give. The girl began moving more, now her hands warming her pet with gentle strokes, and her shoulders straightening, though still weak and still pale. Her eyes burned brighter with every breath. Mark noticed the way she now kept her head up more often, and how she no longer shivered constantly. The heat was helping, yes, but more than that, it was the knowledge that she had not been left behind, the feeling that she had been seen, and that someone had come for her without knowing her, without needing a reason beyond simple choice. Then the sky above them lit up, not with thunder or storm, but with the flashing lights of engines breaking through the clouds. A sound, faint at first, then growing louder like a low hum, carried on the wind. The girl's head turned quickly, her eyes searching the opening of the wreck, and Mark rose slowly, stepping outside. As the snow blew across his visor, he shielded his eyes and saw it a shape in the sky growing larger, sleek and silver, and alive with motion, the rescue shuttle cutting through the last of the gray with purpose and direction. He turned back to the girl, stepped inside, and gestured to her calmly. She looked at him unsure, then looked up through the crack in the hull, saw the shape approaching, and for a moment her mouth parted in disbelief. Then she clutched her pet close and stood using the wall for balance. Mark moved to help her, and together they stepped outside into the pale light, the cold still sharp around them but no longer filled with hopelessness. The shuttle landed with a slow burst of steam, its ramp unfolding with mechanical grace, and 2 crew members stepped out dressed in heavy survival gear. One of them rushed forward, scanning for life signs, then stopped upon seeing the girl and her pet beside the human, whose suit was cracked and frostbitten, yet still standing strong. The scene froze for a moment as all 3 locked eyes. Then the rescuers moved quickly, wrapping the girl in thermal wraps, lifting her gently into waiting arms, while another lifted the creature into a safe carrier. Mark stumbled slightly, his knees buckling, but he waved off the help, pointing to the girl instead, making sure she went first before him, always her first, then anything else. Only after she was secured inside the shuttle and her pet placed safely in a warm pod did he finally allow himself to sit as the medic wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and placed an oxygen mask over his face. His breath finally came deeper, slower, and he let his eyes close for just a moment. The girl turned inside the shuttle and looked back, saw him seated, wrapped in warmth, yet pale and still, and her voice rose once weak but clear, speaking his name, the one she had only learned hours ago, and the sound of it hung in the air like a single beam of light in a dark cave. The shuttle lifted moments later, leaving behind the wreck and the storm, and rising toward the stars, carrying with it 2 lives that had crossed in the cold and left behind something the ice could never bury. The shuttle moved through space like a quiet guardian, carrying within it the fragile weight of survival. The walls hummed with life and warmth, soft lights lit the interior, and blankets were wrapped tight around those who had endured the ice. Lyra sat in silence, her small hands resting on her lap, her body still weak but her eyes more awake than before. Beside her on a padded bench lay Tavi, finally breathing peacefully, his fur clean, his tail curled in gentle sleep across from her. The man named Mark rested in the sealed recovery pod, tubes connecting to his arms, a mask over his face feeding him air rich with oxygen and heat. The damage from the cold had pushed his body close to the edge, but his heartbeat had stayed strong. His body had refused to surrender, even after everything, even after walking into the storm alone to save someone he had never met. Lyra watched the numbers on the pod flicker, gently green lines moving with calm rhythm, a sign that he was still fighting. When the shuttle reached the orbiting station, doctors rushed in, fast and careful voices, low but urgent hands working with quiet speed. Mark was taken away first, rolled through wide corridors under bright lights and into a treatment bay where machines read his vitals and medics moved around him like a dance of precision and care. Lyra followed slowly, her legs unsure, her steps light but steady, her eyes never leaving the figure of the man who had become something more than just a rescuer. Commander of the station came to see her with curious eyes and a translator device in his hand. He asked her name, asked where she was from, asked what happened, but her answers were few and soft, her words not ready to form all that had passed. The images still sharp in her memory, the crash, the cold, the silence, and then the light that arrived, wrapped in a voice and a hand and a warmth that did not belong to her world, yet saved it all the same. Tavi stayed beside her through the days that followed. Doctors checked in, too surprised at how the little creature had survived such brutal cold, and still had energy left to climb onto Lyra's lap and fall asleep every time she sat still long enough. Together, they waited near the recovery room where Mark lay, healing each day a little better, the machines now quieter, the lights softer, the air full of gentle hope. She sat there, often eyes closed, fingers tracing the edge of the bracelet she had made from the emergency cloth strips and pieces of cord left in the shuttle. She did not know if it was beautiful, but it held meaning, and that was enough. She had never spoken much to humans before. Her people lived far from Their colonies distant and cautious, but now all she could remember was the sound of one human voice breaking through a storm, whispering, "Stay awake. I've got you now, you're not alone," when Mark finally opened his eyes days later, blinking at the lights above him and breathing steady under his mask. He saw her face first beside the pod, quiet and waiting, her hands holding something wrapped in cloth. She smiled, not wide, not loud, but full of warmth, and he knew then that they had made it, not just through the cold, not just through the storm, but through something deeper, the kind of darkness that lives inside. When everything is stripped away and only choice remains, she placed the bracelet beside his hand, fingers brushing his gently, and whispered his name again, slow and sure, like a promise or a song, something that did not need translation because it already spoke to what had passed between them. Mark smiled weakly, eyes wet with emotion, but voice too dry to speak just yet. The nod he gave her said more than enough. News of the rescue spread fast across human networks, and beyond reports carried the story of a lone human who defied orders and risked his life to save an alien girl and her creature on a world marked dead on all maps. Articles appeared across colonies, stations, and trade hubs showing the image of the broken wreck, the storm clouds, the rescue shuttle, and a blurred photo of a young girl with pale skin holding her pet close. As they stepped into the light for the first time, her people reached out days later. A signal broadcast from deep space, a message of thanks and a request to meet the human who had saved one of their own. Lyra returned home soon after, but not without visiting the recovery bay one final time. She did not speak much, she only stood there quietly, eyes resting on the man who had changed everything. In the silence of snow and fire, she lifted her hand to her chest, then extended it to him, palm open, and then closed like a farewell filled with respect and something more. Mark was cleared for discharge weeks later, his body slow to heal, but his spirit steady. The cold had left its mark, but it had not broken him. He returned to duty after months, not to fly again, but to train new recruits, teach them not just how to survive storms, but how to listen for voices buried in silence, how to see life where others see risk, and how to follow instinct when orders say no, but your heart says go. He kept the bracelet always on his wrist or near his bunk, depending on where he was, and he often found himself staring at it during quiet nights, wondering where the girl was now, if she still remembered. The broken shelter, the weak heater, the soft voice in a language they barely shared, yet fully understood. Time talks between her people and humans opened a small bridge built not by diplomats or fleets, but by one choice in the middle of nowhere. A simple act of courage that had no plan and no promise, only a voice saying, "I will come even if no one else will," and a hand reaching through the dark when the light had almost gone. And though they never met again, not in halls or stations or cities, their names remained linked in records and memory. The girl who survived the storm with her creature, pressed close, and the man who walked into death, just to make sure she would see another day in the coldest part of the galaxy, a place once marked only by silence and loss, now carried a new name, a name written in quiet respect and warm remembrance. A name that told everyone who passed by that once there was a fire that refused to go out, and a bond born not of blood or command but of choice and hope, and the simple truth that some lives are worth saving even when no one is watching. The end.